The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned interstate as Marcus Rodriguez crouched behind the rusted shell of an overturned semi-truck, his weathered hands gripping a makeshift spear fashioned from a broken road sign and kitchen knife. 6 months had passed since the outbreak began, and the world he once knew had crumbled into a nightmare of flesh-hungry monsters and desperate survivors. The silence was deceptive. Marcus had learned that quiet moments like these often preceded the most violent encounters. His group of 12 survivors had been traveling for weeks, searching for the rumored safe zone beyond the mountains, but their supplies were dwindling and tensions were rising. Behind him, he could hear the soft whispers of his companions: Elena Vasquez, a former nurse whose medical skills had kept them alive through countless injuries; Jake Thompson, a mechanic whose knowledge of vehicles had proven invaluable; and Rebecca Foster, a teacher who had become their unofficial strategist. The infected had been tracking them for 3 days now, and Marcus knew they were running out of places to hide. The first sign of trouble came as a low moan echoing from the direction they had traveled, followed by the distinctive shuffle of decomposing feet against asphalt. Marcus raised his hand, signaling for absolute silence as he peered around the truck's twisted metal frame. What he saw made his blood run cold: a horde of at least 50 infected stumbling down the highway, their gray skin hanging in tatters, their milky eyes scanning hungrily for any sign of life. These weren't the slow, shambling zombies from old movies. The virus had evolved, creating creatures that retained enough motor function to move with purpose and enough intelligence to hunt in coordinated groups. Some still wore the remnants of their former lives: business suits, hospital scrubs, children's clothing, but their humanity had been stripped away, leaving only an insatiable hunger for living flesh. Elena pressed herself against Marcus's back, her breathing shallow and controlled as she watched the approaching nightmare. She had seen too much death in recent months, had been forced to make impossible choices about who could be saved and who had to be left behind. The medical knowledge that once helped her heal now served primarily to identify bite marks and determine how long someone had before they turned. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the surgical scalpel she carried, not for healing anymore, but for the quick, precise cuts needed to sever spinal cords when mercy became necessary. The weight of every life lost under her care pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden, but she had learned to compartmentalize her grief in order to keep functioning. Jake's mind raced as he calculated their options, his engineer's brain automatically assessing escape routes and defensive positions. The semi-truck they hid behind was positioned near an overpass, and he could see the skeletal remains of several vehicles that might still have functional parts. His backpack contained a collection of tools and spare parts he had scavenged over the months, and he wondered if there was enough time to hotwire one of the abandoned cars before the horde reached them. The infected moved in a loose formation, but Jake had observed their behavior long enough to know they would spread out once they caught a scent, making escape exponentially more difficult. His calloused hands moved instinctively to the wrench hanging from his belt, a tool that had become as much weapon as instrument. Rebecca's teacher instincts kicked in as she mentally catalogued the group's strengths and weaknesses, formulating plans with the same methodical approach she once used for lesson planning. She had become the group's unofficial leader through necessity rather than choice, her ability to remain calm under pressure and think several steps ahead proving invaluable in their survival. The children in their group, Tommy, age 8, and his sister Amy, age 6, were hidden in a drainage culvert 50 yards away with 2 other adults, but Rebecca knew that if the infected discovered their main group, it would only be a matter of time before they found the others. Her mind worked through contingency plans, backup routes, and worst-case scenarios with the efficiency of someone who had been forced to adapt quickly to a world where a single mistake meant death. The infected were close enough now that the survivors could smell them, the sickly sweet stench of decay mixed with something else, something that reminded Marcus of copper pennies and fear. He had learned to read the subtle differences in zombie behavior, understanding that fresh infections moved differently than those that had been turned for weeks or months. This particular horde seemed to contain a mix of both, suggesting they had recently encountered other survivors and added to their numbers. The thought sent a chill down his spine as he wondered if any of those new additions had been people he knew, fellow travelers on the same desperate journey toward safety. As the first infected rounded the front of the semi-truck, Marcus made a split-second decision that would determine whether his group lived to see another sunset. He burst from cover with a war cry that echoed off the concrete barriers, his improvised spear finding its mark in the skull of the lead zombie. The element of surprise bought them precious seconds as the horde momentarily hesitated, their primitive brains processing this new threat. Elena, Jake, and Rebecca moved with practiced efficiency, each taking predetermined positions as they had rehearsed countless times before. The battle for their lives was about to begin, and they all knew that in this new world, there were no second chances, only survivors and the infected, locked in an eternal struggle where humanity's future hung in the balance with every encounter. The infected surged forward like a tide of rotting flesh, their collective moans rising to a deafening crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the overpass. Marcus pulled his spear free from the first zombie's skull with a wet, sucking sound and immediately pivoted to face the next threat, a woman in a blood-stained wedding dress whose jaw hung at an unnatural angle. Elena had positioned herself near a concrete barrier, using her medical knowledge of human anatomy to make precise strikes with her scalpel, targeting the brain stem with surgical accuracy. Each kill was clean and efficient, but she knew they couldn't maintain this pace for long against such overwhelming numbers. Jake had managed to reach an abandoned pickup truck and was frantically working to hotwire the engine, his tools scattered across the driver's seat as infected hands began pounding against the windows. Rebecca found herself separated from the others as a group of infected flanked their position, forcing her to retreat toward the drainage ditch where the children were hidden. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the terrible choice before her: lead the zombies away from Tommy and Amy, or try to fight through them to rejoin Marcus and the others. A former construction worker, still wearing his hard hat despite half his face being missing, lunged at her with surprising speed. Rebecca dodged to the side and brought her crowbar down on his skull with enough force to crack the concrete beneath him. The impact sent vibrations up her arms, but there was no time to process the shock as 3 more infected emerged from behind an overturned bus. The sound of Jake's engine finally turning over cut through the chaos like a beacon of hope, but the celebration was short-lived as infected began climbing onto the truck's hood and roof. Through the windshield, he could see their decaying faces pressed against the glass, leaving smears of black blood and tissue. He threw the truck into reverse, crushing several zombies beneath the wheels, but more kept coming. The fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank, enough to get them a few miles down the road, but not nearly enough to reach the safe zone. Jake's mind raced through calculations of distance, fuel consumption, and the weight of passengers as he maneuvered the vehicle toward his trapped companions. Marcus had backed himself against the semi-truck's trailer, using the confined space to limit the number of infected that could attack him simultaneously. His spear work had become a deadly dance, each thrust and parry honed by months of desperate survival. But exhaustion was setting in, and he could feel his movements becoming sluggish. A teenage boy in a Letterman jacket grabbed the spear shaft, and Marcus was forced to abandon the weapon, drawing the hunting knife from his belt. The close-quarters combat was brutal and intimate. He could see the confusion in the zombie's eyes, as if some fragment of the boy's former self was still trapped inside the infected shell. Elena had climbed onto the concrete barrier and was making her way toward the truck, but a group of infected had noticed her elevated position and were attempting to follow. One particularly agile zombie, a former athlete whose muscle memory seemed to aid his climbing ability, had managed to grab her ankle. She kicked frantically, her boot connecting with his face repeatedly, but his grip remained iron-strong. The scalpel in her hand was too small for this kind of combat, and she found herself wishing she had chosen a larger weapon. Below her, she could see more infected gathering, their arms reaching upward like a forest of grasping branches. Rebecca had managed to create some distance between herself and the pursuing zombies by using her knowledge of the terrain to her advantage. She had noticed earlier that several manholes covers were missing, creating gaps in the road surface that could trip up the less coordinated infected. Her strategy was working, but she was being driven further away from the group and closer to the drainage ditch where the children waited. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her as she realized that her decisions in the next few minutes would determine not just her own fate, but the survival of 2 innocent children who depended on the adults to protect them. Jake had managed to position the truck near Marcus, but the infected were swarming the vehicle faster than his friends could reach it. He made the difficult decision to use the truck as a weapon, ramming it into clusters of zombies to clear a path. The sickening thuds of bodies against metal filled the air, and he tried not to think about the fact that each impact represented someone who had once been human. The windshield was now completely obscured by gore, forcing him to navigate by sound and instinct. He could hear Marcus shouting directions, but the words were lost in the cacophony of moans and breaking glass. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and each survivor faced impossible choices that would test not only their will to live, but their commitment to maintaining their humanity in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. The infected showed no signs of tiring, their numbers seemingly endless as more emerged from the surrounding buildings and vehicles. Time was running out, and the survivors knew that their next actions would determine whether they lived to continue their desperate journey toward the rumored safe zone, or join the ranks of the mindless horde that now surrounded them on all sides. The truck's engine roared as Jake executed a desperate maneuver, spinning the vehicle in a tight circle to create a momentary clearing in the horde. Marcus seized the opportunity and sprinted toward the passenger door, his boots slipping on the blood-slicked asphalt as infected hands grasped at his clothing. He dove through the open window just as a zombie in a nurse's uniform lunged forward, her teeth snapping inches from his leg. Elena had managed to break free from the climbing zombie by driving her scalpel deep into his eye socket, but the effort had cost her precious seconds and now she found herself stranded on the concrete barrier with no clear path to the truck. The infected below had multiplied, creating a writhing sea of decomposing bodies that reached upward with desperate hunger. Rebecca's situation had become increasingly dire as she found herself pinned between two groups of infected, with the drainage ditch containing the children directly behind her. She could hear Tommy's muffled sobs echoing from the concrete tunnel, and the sound nearly broke her resolve. The crowbar in her hands felt impossibly heavy as she faced down a former police officer whose badge was still pinned to his torn uniform. His service weapon was missing from its holster, probably taken by another survivor long ago, but his hands moved with muscle memory toward where it should have been. Rebecca realized with growing horror that some infected retained fragments of their former training and instincts, making them far more dangerous than the mindless shambling masses. Jake had managed to position the truck beneath Elena's perch, but the vehicle was taking a beating from the constant assault of infected fists and bodies. The windshield had developed a spider web of cracks, and he could feel the suspension groaning under the weight of zombies climbing onto the roof and hood. Elena prepared to jump, knowing she would have only one chance to land safely in the truck bed. As she leaped, a zombie grabbed her medical bag, jerking her sideways and sending her crashing into the truck's side panel instead of the bed. She hit hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs as she slid down toward the waiting infected. Marcus had climbed into the passenger seat and was now leaning out the window, using his hunting knife to clear zombies from Elena's position. Each strike had to be precise, there was no room for error when his friend's life hung in the balance. He managed to create enough space for Elena to scramble into the truck bed, but not before a zombie in a chef's uniform managed to rake his claws across her shoulder, tearing through her jacket and drawing blood. The wound wasn't deep, but in this new world, any injury carried the terrifying possibility of infection. Elena pressed her hand against the scratches, her medical training automatically assessing the damage even as adrenaline coursed through her system. The sound of children crying had attracted more infected to Rebecca's position, and she watched in horror as zombies began emerging from storm drains and abandoned buildings, drawn by the promise of fresh prey. Her teacher's instinct to protect the innocent warred with her survival instincts as she realized that staying to defend the children might doom them all. The police officer zombie had been joined by what appeared to be his former partner, a woman whose tactical vest was shredded but whose movements still showed traces of professional training. Rebecca found herself facing two infected who moved with more coordination than she had ever encountered before. Jake gunned the engine and began driving toward Rebecca's position, but the truck was struggling under the weight of infected clinging to its exterior. The fuel gauge had dropped noticeably, and he could hear concerning sounds from the engine that suggested the vehicle wouldn't last much longer. Through the cracked windshield, he could see Rebecca backing toward the drainage ditch, her crowbar moving in desperate arcs as she tried to keep the infected at bay. The distance between them seemed impossibly vast, filled with dozens of zombies who showed no signs of losing interest in their human prey. Elena had managed to stop the bleeding from her shoulder wound using supplies from her medical kit, but the close call had shaken her more than she cared to admit. From her position in the truck bed, she could see the full scope of their predicament. Infected were emerging from every direction, and their small group was vastly outnumbered. She began preparing additional medical supplies, knowing that more injuries were inevitable if they were going to survive the next few minutes. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind was calculating odds and probabilities that painted an increasingly grim picture of their chances. Rebecca made the agonizing decision to retreat into the drainage tunnel with the children, hoping that the confined space would limit the number of infected that could attack them simultaneously. She called out to Tommy and Amy, instructing them to move deeper into the tunnel system while she held the entrance. The police officer zombie had reached the tunnel mouth, and Rebecca swung her crowbar with all her strength, connecting with his skull in a spray of black blood and bone fragments. But his partner was right behind him, and Rebecca knew she couldn't hold this position indefinitely. The truck finally reached the drainage area, but Jake realized with growing despair that the opening was too small for the vehicle to provide any meaningful rescue. He would have to abandon the truck and fight on foot if they were going to save Rebecca and the children. Marcus was already preparing to exit the vehicle, checking his remaining weapons and steeling himself for what might be their final stand. The infected had surrounded them completely now, and the survivors faced the terrifying reality that their desperate flight might end here, in this forgotten corner of a dead world where hope seemed as distant as the safe zone they had been seeking. Jake made the split-second decision to ram the truck directly into the cluster of infected surrounding the drainage entrance, using the vehicle's momentum to scatter the zombies and create a brief opening. The impact was devastating. Bodies flew in all directions as the truck's front end crumpled against the concrete barrier, steam hissing from the destroyed radiator. Marcus rolled out of the passenger side before the vehicle had completely stopped, his knife already in motion as he engaged the stunned infected who were struggling to regain their footing. The truck's engine gave a final, shuddering gasp before dying completely, leaving them without any means of escape except their own feet and whatever weapons they could carry. Elena vaulted from the truck bed with her medical bag slung across her uninjured shoulder, immediately moving to assist Rebecca, who was still fighting desperately at the tunnel entrance. The police officer zombie had fallen to Rebecca's crowbar, but his partner had managed to grab the weapon's handle, engaging in a deadly tug-of-war that Rebecca was slowly losing. Elena approached from behind and drove her scalpel into the base of the zombie's skull, severing the spinal cord with surgical precision. The infected woman collapsed instantly, but the brief struggle had allowed more zombies to close in on their position. From deep within the drainage tunnel, Tommy's voice echoed with pure terror as he called out that something was moving in the darkness behind them. Rebecca's blood ran cold as she realized they had assumed the tunnel was empty without properly checking, a potentially fatal mistake in a world where infected could be lurking anywhere. The sound of shuffling feet and low moans began emanating from the tunnel's depths, suggesting that their supposed refuge had become a trap. Amy's high-pitched scream pierced the air, followed by the sound of small feet running on wet concrete as the children fled back toward the entrance. Marcus found himself fighting alongside Jake near the destroyed truck, their backs pressed together as they faced waves of infected approaching from multiple directions. Jake had grabbed a tire iron from the truck's wreckage and was using it with brutal efficiency, his mechanical knowledge of leverage and force making each swing devastatingly effective. But both men were beginning to show signs of exhaustion, their movements becoming slower and less precise with each passing moment. The infected seemed endless, emerging from buildings and vehicles like a plague of locusts drawn to the sound of combat. Rebecca made the desperate decision to lead the children out of the tunnel and toward a partially collapsed overpass she had noticed earlier. The structure looked unstable, but it might provide temporary shelter and a vantage point to assess their situation. She grabbed Tommy's hand while Amy clung to her other arm, and together they emerged from the tunnel into the chaos of the ongoing battle. The sight that greeted them was nightmarish, dozens of infected swarmed around their friends, and the destroyed truck burned with black smoke that would undoubtedly attract even more zombies from the surrounding area. Elena had positioned herself as a mobile medic, moving between her companions to provide quick treatment for injuries while avoiding the grasping hands of the infected. She had already treated 3 bite wounds that were thankfully superficial, but she knew their luck couldn't hold forever. Her medical supplies were running dangerously low, and she was being forced to make increasingly difficult decisions about which injuries required immediate attention and which would have to wait. The shoulder wound she had sustained earlier was beginning to throb with a deep, persistent pain that made her wonder if the zombie's claws had been deeper than she initially thought. Jake's tire iron connected with the skull of a zombie wearing a fast food uniform, but the impact sent vibrations up his arm that indicated the makeshift weapon was beginning to fail. The metal was developing stress fractures from repeated use, and he estimated it would break completely within the next few strikes. He began scanning the battlefield for alternative weapons, his engineer's mind automatically cataloging potential tools among the debris scattered around the crash site. A broken piece of rebar caught his attention, but reaching it would require fighting through at least 6 infected who stood between him and the improvised spear. Marcus had managed to clear a small area around the tunnel entrance, but he could see that their position was becoming increasingly untenable. The infected were learning to coordinate their attacks, with some zombies grabbing at weapons while others lunged for exposed flesh. He had observed this behavior before in other encounters. The virus seemed to preserve some capacity for tactical thinking, making the infected far more dangerous than mindless automatons. His hunting knife was becoming dull from repeated use against bone and skull, and he knew that a dull blade in close combat was often worse than no weapon at all. Rebecca had reached the collapsed overpass with the children, but the structure was even more unstable than she had hoped. Large chunks of concrete hung precariously overhead, and the entire framework groaned ominously with each gust of wind. However, it did provide some protection from the infected, who seemed reluctant to follow them into the obviously dangerous structure. Tommy and Amy huddled against her, their small bodies trembling with fear and exhaustion as they watched their adult protectors fighting for their lives in the distance. Rebecca realized with growing despair that even if the others survived the current battle, they were all trapped in an increasingly hopeless situation with no vehicle, limited weapons, and a horde of infected that showed no signs of diminishing. The smoke from the burning truck was beginning to attract infected from further away, and the survivors could see shambling figures emerging from buildings and side streets in response to the beacon of destruction they had inadvertently created. Their desperate fight for survival was about to become exponentially more difficult as reinforcements arrived for their enemies, while their own numbers remained pitifully small and their resources continued to dwindle with each passing moment. The reinforcements arrived faster than anyone had anticipated, a stream of infected pouring from the surrounding urban landscape like ants responding to a disturbance in their nest. Marcus counted at least 30 new zombies shambling toward their position, including several that moved with the unsettling coordination he had come to associate with recently turned victims. Among them was a group that appeared to have been a family before the outbreak, a father still clutching a briefcase, a mother in jogging attire, and 2 teenagers whose school backpacks bounced grotesquely as they stumbled forward. The sight of what had once been an ordinary family now transformed into mindless predators served as a stark reminder of how completely their world had changed. Elena made a critical decision that went against every instinct she had developed as a healer. She began using her medical knowledge not to save lives, but to end them more efficiently. Her understanding of human anatomy allowed her to identify the most vulnerable points on the infected, and she started calling out instructions to her companions about where to strike for maximum effectiveness. The irony wasn't lost on her that the skills she had spent years developing to preserve life were now being used to destroy the twisted remnants of humanity that surrounded them. Her scalpel had become an extension of her will, moving with surgical precision to sever brain stems and spinal cords. Jake's tire iron finally snapped in half during a particularly violent encounter with a zombie wearing construction gear, leaving him with a jagged piece of metal that was more dangerous to himself than to his enemies. He made a desperate dive for the piece of rebar he had spotted earlier, rolling beneath the grasping arms of 3 infected and coming up with the improvised spear in his hands. The rebar was longer than his previous weapon, giving him better reach but requiring different fighting techniques. He had to adapt quickly, using his knowledge of physics and leverage to maximize the weapon's effectiveness while conserving his rapidly depleting energy reserves. Rebecca watched from the unstable overpass as her friends fought desperately below, her mind racing through possible escape routes and tactical options. The children pressed against her sides, their small hands clutching at her clothing as they sought comfort in a world that offered none. She noticed that some of the infected were beginning to lose interest in the main battle and were starting to explore the area more systematically, including the base of the overpass where she and the children were hiding. The structure's instability might protect them from direct assault, but it also meant they were trapped with no easy way to retreat if discovered. Marcus had managed to acquire a new weapon, a crowbar dropped by a fallen survivor whose body lay partially consumed near an abandoned car. The tool felt familiar in his hands, similar to the construction work he had done before the outbreak, and he found himself falling into a rhythm of strike, pivot, and strike again. But the constant combat was taking its toll on all of them, and he could see exhaustion written in the faces of his companions. Elena's movements were becoming less precise, Jake was breathing heavily between attacks, and even Rebecca looked strained as she tried to keep the children calm while monitoring the approaching threats. The infected had begun to exhibit new behaviors that chilled the survivors to their core. Some zombies were using tools and weapons they found scattered around the battlefield. A former mechanic had picked up a wrench and was swinging it with deadly intent, while a zombie in a chef's uniform wielded a cleaver with muscle memory that suggested retained motor skills. This evolution in the infected's capabilities meant that the survivors' advantages in intelligence and tool use were rapidly diminishing. The virus was adapting, creating enemies that combined the relentless hunger of zombies with fragments of human knowledge and skill. Elena had noticed something troubling about her shoulder wound. The scratches were beginning to show signs of infection that seemed to be progressing faster than normal bacterial contamination. The edges of the wounds had taken on a grayish tinge, and she could feel a strange tingling sensation spreading down her arm. Her medical training told her this could be the beginning of the zombie virus taking hold, but she couldn't be certain without proper diagnostic equipment. The possibility that she might be turning into one of the creatures they were fighting added a new layer of urgency to their desperate situation. Jake had managed to use his engineering skills to create a temporary barricade using debris from the truck crash and surrounding wreckage, but the structure was more psychological barrier than physical protection. The infected were already beginning to find ways around and over the improvised fortification, and he knew it would only buy them a few precious minutes at most. His mind was working frantically to devise a more permanent solution, but their options were severely limited by their lack of resources and the overwhelming number of enemies they faced. Rebecca made the agonizing decision to leave the relative safety of the overpass and rejoin the fight, knowing that her friends needed every available hand if they were going to survive the next few minutes. She instructed Tommy and Amy to stay hidden among the concrete debris and promised she would return for them, though she wasn't certain she could keep that promise. The weight of potentially orphaning 2 children in this hellish world pressed down on her as she prepared to descend into the chaos below, but she knew that abandoning her friends would doom them all. The battle had reached a critical juncture where the survivors' ammunition, energy, and hope were all running dangerously low, while their enemies seemed to multiply with each passing moment. The smoke from the burning truck continued to serve as a beacon for more infected, and the survivors realized with growing horror that they might have inadvertently created their own funeral pyre in this forgotten corner of a world where the dead refused to stay buried. Rebecca's descent from the overpass proved more treacherous than anticipated as loose concrete crumbled beneath her feet, sending chunks of debris crashing down among the infected below. The noise drew immediate attention from a cluster of zombies who had been methodically searching the area, and she found herself sliding down the unstable slope faster than intended. She landed hard among the wreckage, her ankle twisting painfully as she rolled to avoid the grasping hands of a zombie in a postal worker's uniform. The creature's mail bag was still slung across its shoulder, a grotesque reminder of the mundane life it had once lived before the virus claimed it. Marcus had noticed Elena's increasingly erratic movements and the way she kept favoring her injured shoulder, but the intensity of combat left no opportunity for proper medical assessment. He fought his way toward her position, using his crowbar to clear a path through 3 infected who had cornered her against an overturned car. When he finally reached her side, he could see the grayish discoloration spreading from her wound, and his heart sank as he recognized the telltale signs of viral infection. Elena met his eyes with a look that confirmed his worst fears. She knew what was happening to her, and they both understood the terrible implications. Jake's makeshift barricade had bought them precious time, but it was rapidly being overwhelmed by the sheer number of infected pressing against it. He had managed to reinforce one section using the truck's spare tire and some twisted metal, but other areas were beginning to buckle under the constant pressure. Through gaps in the debris, he could see more zombies arriving from the surrounding streets, including a group that appeared to be wearing hospital scrubs and moving with the coordinated efficiency of a medical team. The sight sent chills down his spine as he realized that entire professional groups might be turning together, retaining some vestige of their former teamwork. Elena made the most difficult decision of her life as she felt the virus spreading through her system like liquid fire. She began distributing her remaining medical supplies among her companions, her hands shaking as she explained the proper use of each item with clinical detachment. The irony that she, a healer, would become one of the creatures they fought was not lost on her, but she was determined to ensure her knowledge would survive even if she didn't. She pressed a syringe filled with morphine into Marcus's hand, explaining that it would provide a peaceful end if the transformation became inevitable for any of them. Rebecca had managed to reach the main group despite her injured ankle, but her arrival coincided with a coordinated assault by the infected that seemed almost military in its precision. The zombies were no longer simply shambling forward, they were flanking, creating diversions, and even using basic tactics that suggested the virus was preserving more cognitive function than anyone had previously believed. A former security guard was directing other infected with gestures and guttural sounds, organizing them into a formation that would have been impressive if it weren't so terrifying. The sound of Tommy and Amy crying from their hiding place in the overpass debris was beginning to attract infected who had lost interest in the main battle. Rebecca watched in horror as several zombies started climbing toward the children's position, their movements awkward but determined. She knew she had to choose between helping her adult companions in their desperate fight or protecting the children who depended on her. The weight of that decision threatened to crush her spirit, but she forced herself to think like the teacher she had once been, prioritizing the most vulnerable members of their group. Marcus had positioned himself between Elena and the approaching infected, knowing that her deteriorating condition made her increasingly vulnerable. He could see the internal struggle playing out on her face as she fought against the virus's influence, her medical training warring with the growing hunger that threatened to consume her humanity. She had begun to exhibit some of the early symptoms: heightened aggression, dilated pupils, and an unsettling focus on the pulse points of her companions. The transformation was progressing faster than any of them had expected. Jake's engineering mind was working frantically to devise an escape plan, but every option seemed to lead to certain death for at least some of their group. The fuel from the destroyed truck had created a small fire that was spreading to nearby debris, and he realized they might be able to use the flames as a weapon against the infected. However, the same fire that could save them might also trap them in a burning maze with no way out. His hands moved automatically, gathering combustible materials while his mind calculated wind patterns and burn rates. Elena's condition had deteriorated to the point where she was beginning to lose coherent speech, her words becoming slurred and disjointed as the virus attacked her nervous system. She managed to communicate one final piece of crucial information: the location of a cache of medical supplies she had hidden in an abandoned pharmacy several blocks away. The supplies included antibiotics and pain medication that could mean the difference between life and death for the survivors, but reaching the cache would require fighting through streets filled with infected. Rebecca made her choice and began climbing back toward the children's position, her injured ankle screaming with each movement as she hauled herself up the unstable concrete slope. Below her, she could hear the sounds of her friends fighting for their lives, but she knew that Tommy and Amy represented the future of humanity in a way that transcended immediate survival. The infected climbing toward the children were moving slowly due to the difficult terrain, but they were persistent and would eventually reach the hiding spot if not stopped. The battle had evolved into something beyond simple survival, it had become a test of what remained of human compassion and sacrifice in a world where such qualities seemed like fatal weaknesses. Each survivor faced impossible choices that would define not only their chances of living through the next hour, but their ability to maintain their humanity in the face of an enemy that sought to strip away everything that made them human. Rebecca reached the children just as the first infected climber, a zombie in a maintenance worker's coveralls, hauled itself over the concrete ledge where Tommy and Amy were hiding. Without hesitation, she drove her crowbar through the creature's eye socket, the impact sending it tumbling back down the slope and taking two other climbing zombies with it. Tommy had pressed himself protectively in front of his younger sister, his small hands clutching a piece of broken concrete that he was prepared to use as a weapon. The sight of an 8-year-old boy ready to fight for his sister's life in this nightmare world nearly broke Rebecca's heart, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate threat. Below them, Elena had reached the point of no return as the virus completed its assault on her nervous system. Her eyes had taken on the milky appearance of the infected, and her movements had become jerky and unnatural. Marcus stood frozen as his friend and companion transformed before his eyes, the morphine syringe heavy in his hand as he faced the most terrible decision of his life. Elena's last coherent act was to nod at him, a final gesture of consent that gave him permission to do what needed to be done. The injection was swift and merciful, and she collapsed peacefully as the virus lost its hold on a body that could no longer sustain it. Jake had managed to create a ring of fire using gasoline from the truck's tank and debris from the surrounding area, but the flames were spreading faster than he had anticipated. The infected seemed to have an instinctual fear of fire, backing away from the growing blaze, but the survivors were now trapped within a circle that was rapidly shrinking. The heat was becoming unbearable, and smoke was making it difficult to breathe or see clearly. He realized with growing panic that his solution might have bought them time at the cost of creating a different but equally deadly trap. Marcus emerged from his grief-stricken paralysis with a roar of rage that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Elena's death had stripped away the last vestiges of his civilized restraint, and he threw himself into combat with a ferocity that surprised even the infected. His crowbar moved in deadly arcs, crushing skulls and shattering bones as he carved a path through the zombie horde. The other survivors had never seen him fight with such intensity, and they realized that losing Elena had fundamentally changed something inside their leader. Rebecca had managed to secure the children's position temporarily, but she could see that more infected were gathering at the base of the overpass, drawn by the sounds of combat and the scent of living humans. The structure continued to groan ominously, and she noticed that their movements were causing additional concrete to crack and shift. The entire overpass seemed on the verge of collapse, which could either crush them or provide a dramatic escape route if they could time it correctly. She began looking for structural weak points that might be exploited to bring down specific sections. Jake's fire barrier had created an unexpected opportunity as the flames began to spread to nearby buildings, creating multiple sources of light and heat that confused and scattered the infected. Some zombies were drawn toward the new fires, while others retreated from the growing inferno. The chaos provided a brief window of opportunity, but the survivors would need to act quickly before the fires either died down or spread so far that escape became impossible. He began shouting instructions to Marcus about potential escape routes through the gaps in the infected ranks. The pharmacy that Elena had mentioned was visible from their elevated position, its broken windows and scattered inventory telling the story of previous desperate scavenging attempts. Rebecca could see that the building was surrounded by infected, but she also noticed that most of them seemed focused on the current battle rather than guarding the medical supplies. If they could create enough of a distraction, it might be possible for one person to reach the cache while the others drew the zombies' attention elsewhere. Marcus had fought his way to a position beneath the overpass where Rebecca and the children were hiding, his clothes torn and bloodied from his berserker assault on the infected. He looked up at them with eyes that held a mixture of determination and despair, knowing that their group had been reduced to 4 adults and 2 children with virtually no supplies or weapons beyond what they could carry. The loss of Elena had been devastating not just emotionally, but practically. Her medical knowledge and supplies had been crucial to their survival strategy. Tommy surprised everyone by speaking up with a clarity that seemed beyond his years, pointing out that the infected appeared to be avoiding certain areas where the concrete debris was most unstable. His observation suggested that the zombies retained enough self-preservation instinct to recognize obviously dangerous terrain, which could be exploited as a defensive advantage. Amy added that she had noticed some of the infected seemed to be moving in patterns, as if they were following invisible paths or responding to signals that the humans couldn't detect. Rebecca realized that the children's observations might be the key to their survival. Their smaller size and different perspective had allowed them to notice behavioral patterns that the adults had missed in the chaos of combat. She began formulating a plan that would use the infected's apparent reluctance to enter unstable areas, combined with the distraction provided by Jake's fires, to create a path toward the pharmacy and the medical supplies they desperately needed. The plan was risky and would require perfect timing, but it represented their best chance of escaping the trap they had inadvertently created. The survivors stood at a crossroads where their next decisions would determine not only their immediate survival, but whether they could maintain their humanity and protect the innocent lives that depended on them in a world where hope had become the rarest and most precious commodity of all. The plan Rebecca devised was audacious in its simplicity. They would use the overpass's structural instability as both weapon and escape route. She had identified a series of support pillars that were already cracked from years of neglect and recent seismic activity, and calculated that a coordinated assault on these weak points could bring down a specific section of the overpass directly onto the largest concentration of infected. Tommy and Amy would remain in their hiding spot while the adults executed the plan, with Marcus and Jake working together to weaken the supports while Rebecca created a diversion to draw more zombies into the target zone. Marcus had found a sense of purpose in Rebecca's plan that helped channel his grief over Elena's death into focused action. He positioned himself at the base of the most damaged support pillar, using his crowbar to chip away at the concrete while Jake worked on the steel reinforcement with tools salvaged from the truck wreckage. The infected were drawn to the noise of their demolition work, shambling closer to investigate the source of the rhythmic pounding. Neither man spoke as they worked, but they moved with the synchronized efficiency of people who had learned to trust each other completely in life-or-death situations. Rebecca had climbed to a position on the overpass where she could see the entire battlefield spread out below her. The fires Jake had started were beginning to die down, but they had served their purpose by scattering the infected and creating multiple focal points of activity. She began throwing chunks of concrete and debris to create noise patterns that would draw the zombies toward the area directly beneath the weakened support structure. Her teacher's voice, trained to project across noisy classrooms, proved invaluable as she called out taunts and challenges that seemed to enrage the infected and make them more aggressive in their pursuit. Jake's engineering calculations indicated they had perhaps 2 minutes before the structural damage they were inflicting would cause an uncontrolled collapse that could kill them all. He could see stress fractures spreading through the concrete like spider webs, and the steel reinforcement was beginning to bend under the weight it was no longer properly supporting. The timing would have to be perfect. Too early and the infected would scatter before the collapse, too late and they would be caught in the destruction themselves. The infected had begun to mass beneath the overpass in numbers that exceeded even Rebecca's optimistic projections. The combination of noise, movement, and the scent of living humans had drawn zombies from blocks away, creating a concentration of enemies that would have been impossible to fight through using conventional means. Among the crowd, she could see the security guard zombie who had been coordinating the others, still attempting to organize the horde even as they pressed forward in response to her diversionary tactics. Marcus delivered the final blow to his support pillar just as Jake completed his work on the steel reinforcement, and both men sprinted away from the structure as the first ominous groans echoed through the air. The collapse began slowly, with small pieces of concrete raining down on the infected below, but quickly accelerated into a thunderous avalanche of debris that crushed dozens of zombies beneath tons of rubble. The sound was deafening, and the ground shook with the impact of the falling overpass section. Rebecca had timed her own escape perfectly, leaping from the collapsing structure onto a pile of debris that provided a relatively safe landing zone. She immediately began making her way toward Tommy and Amy's hiding spot, which had been protected from the collapse by its position on a more stable section of the overpass. The children emerged from their shelter with wide eyes and dust-covered faces, but they were unharmed and ready to follow her lead toward whatever came next. The collapse had eliminated a significant portion of the infected horde, but it had also created new challenges for the survivors. The rubble field was difficult to navigate, and the noise had undoubtedly attracted more zombies from the surrounding area. However, it had also created a clear path toward the pharmacy where Elena's medical supplies waited, and the survivors knew this might be their only opportunity to reach the cache before being overwhelmed by reinforcements. Jake had sustained a minor injury during his escape from the collapsing overpass. A piece of rebar had grazed his leg, leaving a bleeding gash that would need attention once they reached safety. Marcus had emerged unscathed but emotionally drained, the physical exertion of the demolition work having provided only temporary relief from his grief over Elena's death. Both men knew they were running on adrenaline and determination, but their reserves were nearly exhausted. The pharmacy stood before them like a beacon of hope in the devastated landscape, its broken windows and scattered inventory promising the medical supplies they desperately needed to treat injuries and continue their journey toward the rumored safe zone. Rebecca gathered the group together for what she knew might be their final coordinated effort, looking into the faces of her companions and seeing the same mixture of exhaustion, determination, and fragile hope that she felt in her own heart. As they prepared to make their dash toward the pharmacy, the survivors carried with them not just the physical tools they needed for survival, but the knowledge that they had managed to maintain their humanity and protect the innocent even in the face of overwhelming darkness. The battle had cost them dearly, but it had also proven that hope, courage, and sacrifice could still triumph over the forces that sought to reduce them to mere animals fighting for survival in a world where the dead walked among the living.